If you don't use a queen excluder in a horizontal Layens hive, how can you extract honey? That's a question that I get a lot. The assumption behind the question is that without a queen excluder to control where the queen is laying, she will spread her brood out throughout the entire hive. But in the typical colony, the bees make it much easier on us. I'll tell you how. Starting out, I want to clarify that it is possible to use a queen excluder in a Layens hive. You could take a plastic excluder and simply cut it to size to fit vertically in between the frames. Or you could use a divider board, which is typically used to define the space in the hive for the colony, and cut the middle out of the divider board and then cover that with either plastic or metal queen excluder material. That's similar to what I did in my conversion hive to make an excluder to go in between the Layens frames and the Langstroth frames. But I've never found it necessary to use a queen excluder in my Layens horizontal hives. The bees will usually lay out their comb to put the brood closest to the entrance. In this case, my entrance is to my right, and so the comb that the brood will be on will be more to my right in this hive. And the number of combs they take for their brood is based on the capacity of a single queen to lay. A queen can only lay eggs so fast, and it only takes so much space for that brood to keep up with her. What I mean is that by the time she fills up a certain amount of space, the oldest brood is emerging, and those cells are being cleaned up and ready for her to go back and lay again. So you can support the queen's laying activities with a certain amount of space. In the Layens hive, that maxes out to about 7 frames. I suspect that the way that bees lay out their colony in any sort of horizontal hive, whether it's a long Langstroth or a top bar hive, will be pretty consistent. The only difference is the number of frames it takes based on frame size. For a Langstroth hive, it takes about 10 frames to give the queen all the capacity she needs for laying. In a top bar hive, it's going to depend on how deep the combs are that the bees build. I hope that my friends who use other types of horizontal hives will leave a comment and let me know if this is consistent with what you see in your hives. So what we'll see in the hive is that the first 7 or 8 frames will have brood on them. And the reason I say 7 or 8 is because the first frame is typically always honey and pollen. After that, we see 6 or 7 frames that will be brood. So our brood in this hive will probably end right about on this frame. I do want to mention about that first frame being mostly honey and pollen. That is nearly always the case. And recently at the Ozarks Homesteading Expo, I was telling people that you can pretty much count on that first frame to be honey and pollen. But something else I told people at that expo is that when you think you know everything about the hives, the bees will teach you something different. And as I was inspecting 7 hives yesterday, I found some variation in how the bees used that first frame. In fact, I found one colony that put their brood all the way up to that first frame and didn't have a lot of resources on that frame beyond what you would expect on a typical brood frame. So although the bees are typically consistent, it's worth verifying. So let's get into the hive and see if the bees have matched what I expect. Now this first frame I'm pulling out is a honey frame, but there's obviously not a lot of comb built on that. That's to give the bees space to expand. And there's quite a few small hive beetles on that frame. Not real pleased about that, but this being the frame at the very end of the hive, I would expect the bees to herd the beetles to the end, and hopefully we won't see as many farther into the colony. So pulling the second frame, this is a heavy one. It's clearly a honey frame, pretty much fully filled out, not completely capped, but a lot of those uncapped cells also don't have nectar on them. On this side you see a little uncapped section at the top. There is nectar in there, but that is a heavy honey frame. Some of these frames I may be able to harvest here in a little bit. As we go into winter, I'll be confirming that the colony has a full honey frame at each end and a band of honey across the top of the frames, which the bees really take care of that band of honey as long as you have locally acclimated bees. If they are bees from somewhere else, say you got a package from somewhere outside of your climate area, then you may need to feed to help the bees build that up. Pulling this next frame, it's another heavy frame. We've got capped honey on that side and pretty much honey and some uncapped nectar on the other side. Now we're down to what I predicted would be our last honey frame, and this next frame I predicted would be our first brood frame. So as I pull this frame, again I'm seeing honey at the top, nectar down below. This other side has more capped honey. And now we'll see what's on our first brood frame here, or what I called the brood frame. Now I would expect, with that being my last expected honey frame, I would have expected to see more pollen on that. But as long as they're storing pollen along with the brood, that's not a big deal. Okay, this frame doesn't have as much weight. And there we've got some capped brood, some mixed brood on there. We've got capped brood. We got some larvae in there. I don't have strong light to look down inside of those cells, but this is very clearly our first brood frame. So in this colony, the bees have laid things out very consistently and very predictably with what I would have expected to see. I will concede that that is not always the case. As I was telling people at the expo, I kind of pulled a number out of the air and said that it seems like about 1 out of 5 hives the queen will wander and will spread her brood throughout the hive. And I don't worry too much about that. There's a couple things that I will try to do. Number one, if I find the queen on frames farther down the hive than those first 8 frames, I'll catch her and move her back to the end of the hive closest to the entrance. And then I'll take a full honey frame and put it in as the 8th frame. And typically when the queen is moving through the hive, if she gets to a frame that's all honey, especially capped honey, she will turn around and go back the other way rather than going past that, typically. But if things persist and the queen just keeps laying throughout that hive, it's still not a loss. Now, I won't be able to harvest honey from those frames with brood on them, but I will be able to use those frames as resources if I have another hive that's in trouble. So it's nice to have a hive that is producing frames that have honey and pollen and brood all on one frame. So it's kind of a gift. Now, as far as that 1 in 5 number, I may have overestimated that, because as I was inspecting hives yesterday, I looked through 7 hives, and 5 of those hives had this consistent pattern. I should have taken my camera with me and gotten this video then, but it was very predictable. Honey frames, honey with pollen, and then brood closest to the entrance. The only reason it was 5 out of the 7 is that the other 2 colonies were fairly weak and small, so they didn't have enough frames to really evaluate whether that queen would wander through the hive or not. So it was nice to see that the bees were laying things out. They had read the manual, they'd studied the books, and they were laying things out just as expected. Let's go in a little farther. Okay, pulling this next frame, this is another brood frame. It's got some cap brood at the top of the frame here. Looking down in there, I am seeing some young larvae throughout there. Some of these cells are drone cells and they don't have anything in those, which is what I would expect, that they wouldn't be making drones this time of year. We've got some pollen on this other side. If you can see kind of in the middle there, there's some cells with pollen. And I am seeing some cells with eggs here. So my queen may be close by here somewhere. I'm hearing some noise in the background here. I'm not sure if it's heavy equipment or possibly a little bit of thunder moving in. So we won't spend any more time than necessary in the hive, because if it is a storm moving in, the bees will get a little irritated. This next frame, as we continue through, I can see right now, looking down in there, it's got quite a bit of cap brood on it. So we got pretty nice cap brood on that frame. More cap brood on the other side. I'm going to push my way back to the end and just see what the bees have going on with these last couple frames. I don't need to look at every single frame here. We've seen the honey on the end. We've seen brood. Now I'm just curious about how this opposite end of the hive looks as we are coming into fall, kind of starting to do some preliminary checks to make sure the bees have things kind of ready for winter. If by chance this hive doesn't have a honey frame on this end, then we may take one of those frames from the other end and go ahead and put it here so that they have that in place and ready to go. I will pull and look at this frame because I want to demonstrate. Now you can see this frame is not fully built out, but what they have on here, and this is the third frame from the end, what they have on here is pretty much, they've got the band of honey at the top that's capped, we can see that, but they're also filling the rest of that frame with nectar. So they're already kind of backfilling there. I'm guessing going to be filling up, slowing down their brood production here fairly soon. So that is third frame from the end, so they may have more honey here on the end than we will really need to leave them for winter. And actually the honey on the ends is what they use for spring. The honey at the top of the frames is what they use for winter. This frame is one, it's kind of wonky shaped because it had comb collapse earlier this year. This was my only frame that collapsed this year, and it was at the very end of this hive. The Tajma hive that I'm working in is not an insulated hive. It has double walls and an airspace on the front and back, but the ends are just 3/4 inch plywood. So there wasn't a whole lot of anything to keep the heat from building up on that end when the sun hit it in the mornings. And so this frame did collapse some. You can kind of see here the signs at the bottom of that comb collapse, but it didn't really harm the colony. The bees have kind of built it back from where it was. A little goofy looking, but that's another honey frame there. And finally on the very end, we've got another honey frame. And this one illustrates if we do move frames around, and if we were moving some honey frames to the end of the colony, we want to be careful about how we do that. Typically you want the frames to be kept in the same order and same orientation as the bees build them, especially when you're letting the bees build out natural comb. And this is a good example of that. This is a frame that I put in the end here to kind of try to encourage the bees to build that collapsed frame straight when they built it back out. And they didn't do a bad job, except where there was a gap in that collapsed frame. I don't know if you'll be able to tell on the camera here, but there is a bump out right here in the middle of this frame. So they built this out to match the contour of that other frame. So if I were moving this frame around in the hive, I would need to be careful where I put that so I'm not smashing frames into each other and closing up the bee space. Beyond that, this is clearly another honey frame. So this is a third honey frame on that end. Although it's not full, it's mostly full on this side, but the other side has a lot of empty cells. And I don't know if you can tell, there's also quite a few small hive beetles in there. I need to get myself a little vacuum tool or something to suck those out. But this frame is also on the very end. So like we saw when we first opened the hive, we saw some hive beetles on the first frame. Now we're seeing quite a few on that last frame. And as our weather cools down, especially after we get to our first freeze, it should knock those out. I'm not seeing any slimed honey, any honey that looks greasy, or any honey that smells bad. The reason that happens when you have hive beetles is because their larvae carries an enzyme that causes the honey to ferment. And that honey is no good for, human consumption, and the bees typically won't use it either. So there's a few hive beetles in there, but the bees have them kind of herded to the end. If I close this up, the bees will typically sequester those hive beetles in little propolis pins, and so we'll kind of let them keep going, because I don't see that the hive beetles are a real problem for the hive right now. And that is definitely thunder, so it's a good time to be closing this up. So as we've gone through this hive, we pretty much find what we expected, that the bees are keeping their brood close to the entrance and the honey is beyond that. The one thing that was a little unexpected is that they're storing more honey than I would have expected on the end closest to the entrance. So that only leaves them about 5 frames of brood, but they're filling those frames pretty well. So when I come back next month to do a final winter check and get this colony buttoned up for winter, I may be able to harvest more frames than I would have otherwise expected from this hive. I hope this has been helpful to demonstrate how I can harvest honey from the Layens Horizontal hive without having to use a Queen Excluder. The super simple answer is really, if I just let the bees lay things out the way that they typically do, they make it easy for me. I want to thank my patrons for your support in helping to keep this channel going. My Patreon community is fairly small right now, but if you would be interested in giving support through Patreon, I would really appreciate you becoming a part of that community. If you found this video interesting, you might check out this video that YouTube thinks you'll really like. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.